Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to make a start as there's plenty of people making their way to us or already online. So thank you for joining us today. Today's the second of two events that Allen Overy are hosting together with Governors for Schools about exclusion. And I hope lots of you are with us for the first one as well. My name's Jane Higgins. I'm a partner at Allen Overy and I've been a trustee of Governors for Schools for nearly 3 years. And we at Allen Overy have a long tradition of supporting educational programmes and particularly working with both challenging schools and young people who are persistently disadvantaged. We are looking to find ways to support students, parents, teachers and school governors to become better informed about school exclusions and find good workable solutions to ensure that no student is unfairly excluded from their right to an education. So today we're going to consider the part governors play in that, and we've got a fantastic group of panelists ready to share their views. The aim of today is really to consider some of the practical things schools and boards can be doing to challenge the decisions to exclude and to make sure that when a decision has been taken, it's been done at the very last resort. I'm delighted to introduce our panellists joining us today. We've got first up Mital Raitata, who's the Head of Education and Community Care at Just for Kids Law. We've also got Samira Sadeghi, Head of Academies Governance at the Academies Enterprise Trust, and Eliza Ribeiro, School Governor, and she's the CEO of the charity Lives Not Knives. Each of our panellists is going to speak for about 10 minutes on their topic and share their thoughts and ideas around the actions that boards can take. And we'll hopefully have time to ask them a couple of questions after they've spoken, and then at the end of everybody we'll have hopefully 10 minutes to share some more questions and answers. Some housekeeping points. You have all been automatically muted, but there is a question function in the go to webinar box, so feel free to put your questions in there and I'll keep an eye on them throughout. We might not be able to get to all of them, but we'll do our best to identify the main questions. This session is being recorded, so it will be available for you to watch back and share tomorrow, and we'll share details of how to do that. So without any further ado, let me just tell you a little bit about our first panellist, Mital Raitata. Mital is the Head of Education and Community Care Law at Just for Kids Law. She's a solicitor and has been a practicing solicitor since 2010 and joined Just for Kids in 2012. She works with children and young people in various matters, including obtaining help from social services, of course, school exclusions, and obtaining support for children with special educational needs. So, Mital, whenever you're ready, we'd love to hear from you.
Hi, so first just to check if I'm sharing my screen. Yeah?
Yeah,
perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you. So thank you for that introduction. I'll go straight into kind of explaining what we do at Just for Kids Law. We're obviously a charity. We were founded in 2006 because of two founding members recognised that children and young people often needed more than legal representation. So we work with and for young people to ensure their legal rights and are respected and promoted, and their voices are heard and valued. What we do, we have a variety of teams that provide different types of support, not just legal support, but our legal support is centred around education, community care, housing, crime and immigration. We have a youth projects team, which includes our youth opportunities team, who support 14 to 25-year-olds with education, training and employment support. Within that team, there's also a really exciting participation project called the School Exclusions Project, which is obviously we're very relevant here. In that project, we have young people who have had some form of experience of an exclusion, whether that's a fixed term exclusion, a permanent exclusion, or some inclusion, etc., and isolation, sorry. And those young people are participating in all of our projects. They are able to get involved in our policy work internally and externally. For example, they attended the APPG on exclusions this year, and they do lots of exciting stuff like podcasts, have kind of written articles, have attended parliamentary meetings. So we're very much trying to get them involved and their voices heard throughout our school exclusions work. We also have a youth advocacy team that support children and young people to have their voices heard and respected by professionals, another legal team that deals with strategic litigation, and a policy and campaigning team. And also, just so that people are aware, we have an online resource called the School Exclusions Hub, which is for professionals to support families and young people with school exclusions, but obviously can be accessed by parents. They can be referred to it too. I wanted to firstly also acknowledge that a lot of what we see is the worst of everything that's happening. So I do know that there is very good practice out there, but it's obviously not what comes to our doorstep. So all of this sounds a bit negative sometimes, and I'm very conscious of that. But it's just to give an idea of what we do see and what the problems are. So the vast majority of young people we represent are obviously very vulnerable. They have a number of social exclusion factors, including being children in need, looked after child, special educational needs, social economic issues. They're potentially at high risk of exploitation. We find a pattern of children with special educational needs being excluded prior to being provided with adequate support to meet their needs, or because their needs can't be met by a school. Obviously, it depends on the situation, but in the latter situation, that's unlawful. Quite often we see a bias towards the school, in particular in relation to safeguarding a school community. So, for example, if we've had a number of cases where young people have accidentally brought in a penknife, left in their bag from the previous day's cadets or something, no previous record, but to ensure that a kind of example is made and school exclusion is issued, or a permanent exclusion on most of those occasions actually. We see a lack of understanding of issues young people face today. For example, sexting is a big issue, social media, the impact of social media on their lives and how infiltrating it is, the risk of exploitation and the impact of an exclusion on the young person itself, and I'll talk about that later. A disproportionate number of exclusions of children as young as 5 or 6. We've had a series of cases, and in those cases actually we've seen a really good response by schools to alter their processes, recognising that it's obviously quite worrying to be excluding children that young, and a number of exclusions upheld at reconsideration hearing. I'd estimate that 90% of the cases that I win at an IRP are then the exclusion is still upheld at a reconsideration, despite what the IRP might have said. And as I said, I talk about the impact on young people, and this is from young people. They say that they have feelings of isolation, that they've been taken out of a journey that their peers are in. A lot of them, and these are older young people who have experienced exclusions, carrying self-blame, even when the exclusion wasn't their fault, it was unfair or found to be, or was overturned. Their self-esteem is impacted. They recognise they've been through a traumatizing experience that impacts them throughout their lives. And the exclusion compounds the instability in their lives, which I'm sure my fellow panelists will talk more about. I also wanted to give case studies to give good examples, but I didn't want to give a case study of my legal work because that doesn't show what's happening to the young people. So I won't read all of these, but just as an example, a young person, all of this has been anonymised obviously, but Zafar, he's autistic, he was excluded due to his behaviour, which is directly linked to his autism. We see this quite often. Zafar, through his own determination, has been able to get to university, but in the process of that, in the process of his education, he's taught himself about autism, and he realises that school just didn't know how to support his needs. And how he described it was that he as a child, everything he saw was from his lens, and that would have been a neurodiverse lens, so he wouldn't have understood what was being asked of him. And that I thought was quite telling of what the impact is on young people. Another example would be Lucy, a looked after child who's permanently excluded for distributing indecent pictures of herself. We get lots of cases like this too on both sides, young people being excluded for distributing pictures of somebody else as well. She denied the allegation and the permanent exclusion was overturned and she was reinstated, but she chose not to go back to the school because of how she was treated and she didn't feel comfortable. The school never apologised to her, which, even though it was recognised that the decision was unlawful, she's still impacted by the actions of the school now. As a result of having to move school, she now has to travel extended periods of time just to get to her school and back, which has a massive impact on her life. Just hopefully these are helpful in understanding how young people feel about how an exclusion impacts them. I also thought it'd be helpful to kind of go through what the guidance says, not in any detail because I'm sure you're all very familiar with it, but just as a reminder that that governing bodies must consider the interests and circumstances of the pupil, the excluded pupil, and of the excluded pupil, the head teacher should give the pupil an opportunity to present their case before taking a decision. I know that's not always possible if there is a police investigation going on, but where possible that should be done. And they should consider representations from parents and head teachers and the local authority. There are some other obviously really helpful provisions. The balance of probabilities being the standard of proof. I thought I'd give my views on how these should be used. The balance of probability, as the guidance says, it's more likely than not that a fact is true. To me, this is based on all the evidence available to the school and the governing body. And it's really important to differentiate between the assumptions that a school or the governing body might have and the facts actually supported by evidence. Also, the school and the governing body should be looking at the judicial review principles and looking at whether the decision to exclude is lawful, rational, reasonable, and procedurally fair. Obviously, being clear on what the law is really important in that, understanding what your role is in that and what the head teacher's role should have been, and asking questions like, has the head teacher or the governing body acted outside of its powers in terms of irrationality and proportionality? Is the decision to exclude reasonable? Is it based on all the relevant points? Does the evidence back up the actual decision? And is the decision proportionate in all the circumstances? The example I gave of the young boys that brought in cadet knives, if they've got no past history, I'm not saying that a decision to uphold that is wrong. What I'm saying is that it's a question, is that reasonable in the circumstances if they have no other issues in the past in terms of their behaviour or such instance? Fairness of procedure, is the governing body acting impartially? Has there been an abuse of power by the head teacher or the governing body by acting unfairly? Is there evidence of unconscious bias? We all have unconscious bias in the head teacher's decision or within the governing body. I thought it would be helpful to just put a reminder that it's obviously unlawful to exclude for any non-disciplinary reasons, including we often get the actions of the parents or disability or special educational needs. And then some other helpful provisions that they will apply more to the head teacher when they're making the decision, really helpful for the governing body to think about when they're reviewing that decision. Are there any contributing factors, such as a bereavement or mental health issues or bullying? Have these been considered by the head teacher? Has the school investigated any underlying causes of disruptive behaviour? For example, have they done the multidisciplinary assessment that's suggested in the guidance, or at least try to identify any of those contributing factors the young person might have? Was the exclusion an appropriate sanction in the circumstances? Is the child from a group of disproportionately high, a group of young people that are disproportionately high rates of exclusion? If so, what steps have been taken to consider what extra support that group needs, but also what that individual needs? Because obviously a group answer isn't always right for every individual. And has the school proactively engaged with the family? Obviously, there are questions about the family also engaging with the school, but it's important, I think, for the governing bodies to consider this when they're reviewing a decision. And then just some kind of pointers on a fair hearing. Obviously, the whole process is there to hold the head teacher to account, and I think it's really important to bear that in mind, even though it's so obvious. Listening and giving weight to the views of the child and the family. putting the child at the centre of any decision making. I mean, I know this isn't the same as kind of social care, but the working together guidance is very much centred around the child, and I think those same principles apply here. And understanding the impact of an exclusion on a child, understanding special educational needs and disabilities and how this might impact a child's behaviour, actions and inactions. I still get cases referred to me about schools saying, well, he's autistic, but that doesn't mean he should be naughty. And that is problematic and shows to me a lack of understanding of, say, special educational needs like autism. Understanding that vulnerable children and young people often display challenging behaviour, and with support to meet their needs, this actually can be addressed, not always, but on most occasions, ensuring that the entire school understands vulnerabilities and challenges faced by children today, like I said before, like special educational needs, risk of exploitation, social media, sexting. But I'd put a caveat in there to not also assume that every child that may look a bit rough or may have been seen smoking weed is likely to be exploited. Having an understanding of what the current social situation is and recognizing and acknowledging any unconscious bias. That's me done. Hopefully I didn't speed through.
Thanks, Miss Al, that was brilliant. And there was lots of content there, so I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. One question I was going to ask you to start with was, you said at the start that obviously your organisation is often involved in the worst kind of cases where things have gone wrong, but can you share some examples of good practice where governing bodies have done things well?
Yeah, definitely. I definitely have a few cases where a head teacher has made a decision to permanently exclude, and a governing body has, from the outset, not even via an IRP decision, chosen to take a step back and look at the situation and make a decision that doesn't involve the school community, and really hold the head teacher to account for their decision making. The scenario that I recall is actually with one of these cadet knife situations where the governing body really did take it back and say, actually, this isn't right. There is a decision here that's not actually relevant to this permanent exclusion. It is not disciplinary action, though it's wrong to obviously bring a knife into school. And I think that was a very good example. And even in, I think in two of the cases that we've had with 5 or 6 year olds, sorry, I can't remember the exact age, schools have really were taken aback by our submissions and have thanked us in an odd way. We don't obviously get ever any gratitude from schools, but thanked us for bringing to light these issues and changed their policies in light of it.
The ones you mentioned about 5 or 6 year olds sound particularly difficult situations. What do you have any pointers you could give for improving how governing bodies can improve their involvement in the process?
Hopefully the ones that I've given to really be alert. The bias, and I feel quite bad saying that, but the unconscious bias really is quite prevalent. There is a sense to me of trying to protect the school community, but that overrides the duties owed to that child that's being excluded. And I think it's really being aware of that and calling it out. And understanding that accessibility for families, this is a scenario, it's a legal scenario where there is no support for families most of the time. So there are only 3 organisations in London, for example, that do this work for free, including us. So there really isn't much support for families unless they get support from other charities. And so they're navigating this by themselves. They won't have any understanding of the legislation, and they potentially won't even they may even have a language barrier. So to really understand and try to provide support for families to be able to engage in the situation. And from our perspective, I'm not sure if every other organisation would say this, but to really engage with the child as well, to understand the perspective where that's appropriate. It's not always appropriate, but where it's appropriate to really engage with the child and understand what's going on in their lives to be able to support them properly, rather than jumping to a conclusion of exclusion over a simple disciplinary matter that could probably be resolved.
Thank you. That's great, Mital. We'll come back to you at the end when we'll have lots more questions for you and the other panelists. But in the meantime, I'm going to turn to Samira. Samira's the head of Academy's governance and clerk to the trustees at Academy's Enterprise Trust, which is a multi-academy trust with 58 schools. Before Samira moved to the UK with her family 11 years ago, she was a criminal defence attorney and spent 12 years representing clients on California's death row in their post-conviction proceedings. Samira, we'd love to hear what you have to add to what Mital said already.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Is it off? Great. And have I presented my screen? Can you see the slides?
We've just got your screen at the minute. I don't think I can see your slides.
Okay, let's see. Is it presenting the right one? Sorry about that. Just want to make sure I'm showing the right. Are you seeing the slides now?
No, it's just your desktop background, I think.
Oh, I don't understand.
Maybe we give it one more go, and if it doesn't work, we can do it without and circulate them.
Okay, hang on. Sorry, I definitely don't want to waste everyone's time trying to get. Oh, I guess I'm not going to be able to do it. Well, it looks like the slides are going to be shared with you anyway. I apologize for that. So I've been advising schools for 5 years on exclusions in 2 very large mats. So I've been involved in more exclusions than I care to remember. I wanted to start with my observations of the system and then give some practical advice about how governors can help address some of the issues that I see. So the first observations around behavior policies. They tend to be pretty incomprehensible sometimes. They don't give good notice exactly of what is expected of the pupil. And often they're poorly written, but they're also illegal. They include things like zero tolerance, which in my view contravenes guidance because head teachers have to have discretion. Sometimes they don't include reasonable adjustments, which you absolutely have to have included. So behavior policies are the first thing. Head teachers on the whole are some of the best well-meaning, hardest working people, but in situations of stress, with time pressure and high emotion, they make poor decisions. And so it's really important to introduce some guards against that. I'm seeing exclusions constantly being used to force access to external resources from the local authority or otherwise. I have to exclude because otherwise this kid won't get a place in the AP. That's a problem. The entire process is weighted in favor of schools. There's just no denying that. I think it was a public policy decision back in 2012 when they changed the guidance, but it absolutely is weighted in favor of the schools. Parents are, for various reasons, unable to access information and kind of understand the process as a whole. This could be because of language barriers or because of education levels. They also are incredibly ill-equipped to advocate for their child. I've seen parents show up to meetings who are really quite mentally ill, or even under the influence of drugs and alcohol. They just are not in a position to be advocating for their child. And really what we need is independent advocacy, which you see sometimes in the States, in the US, they actually get appointed an independent advocate. I'm conscious that's an ideal world, but that's what we need. Governors sometimes come into the meetings and they simply take off their safeguarding hat. It's amazing because we get it drilled into us on a daily basis about safeguarding responsibilities. But they walk into an exclusion meeting and suddenly they just completely forget about safeguarding. And when certain incidents should trigger all the safeguarding red flags, they somehow don't. Governors are also, on the whole, just terrified of overturning head teacher decisions. Obviously have a relationship with a head teacher. They don't want to ruin that relationship. They don't know how they can come back from that. But that obviously is really problematic. We'll talk about how to address that. All parties across the board are not clear on the statutory guidance. That's partly because the statutory guidance itself is incredibly unclear. It's not very well defined, but I find that people just simply don't understand it. The result of all this is that you have inconsistency, you have arbitrariness, you have unfairness, you have exclusions that really just shouldn't be happening. So what can governors do? All right, how can we address all of this? let's talk about before the exclusion. Starting again with behavior policies. When it's your turn to actually, whatever annual or every 4 years, however often the behavior policy is put before you, just don't rubber stamp it. Take a proper look at it. Read it as if you're the pupil or the parent. Would you understand what is expected of you? Is it written in language that's understandable to everyone? Have they included reasonable adjustments? Have they included discretion for the head teacher? I just find often it's missing all kinds of really important information. The behavioral culture of the school and the principles that the school holds, these things need to be agreed by the governors and the head teacher. So how inclusive are we? Do we want to exclude people for things like bringing the school into disrepute? Is that acceptable to us as governors? If you have these conversations in advance, and while you're discussing the behavior policy, then when it comes to decisions, it will be clear for the head teacher. They'll think, oh, well, actually, no, we as a school, we don't do that. And governors and I have agreed on that. So agreeing your standards and your principles is absolutely crucial. Serious incidents. What do we mean by serious incidents? Often you'll see a list, and that's helpful. But I think, again, schools need to define for themselves, will they be permanently excluding for a small amount of marijuana? That would be against the drugs guidance, actually. But those are the kinds of things we need to decide in advance. And what do we mean? The second prong of the test is, so there's a breach. The second prong is that the pupil returning to the school will seriously harm the educational welfare of others. What do we mean by seriously harm? So these things, they're not really well defined in the guidance at all. And it's absolutely up to governors and schools to have these conversations and decide for themselves what they believe. They also need to have conversations about alternatives to exclusion. Alternatives include very expensive options like alternative provision. Governors should decide for themselves. It's a financial decision. Yes, we want to spend the money on alternative provision to avoid exclusion. That's an explicit conversation that needs to be had. All of the alternatives available, and which ones are we going to be wanting to access? And then as a whole, behavior management systems and exclusions data should be regularly scrutinized so that you can find out, is the behavior policy being applied consistently? Are teachers being well trained in how to apply the behavior policy? Is there, sometimes there's a negative spiral for pupils where they get stuck in the detention system and detentions and demerits, and they start to fulfill the prophecy. So looking for those kinds of patterns as governors is very important. But also looking at pastoral systems and making sure that there's joined up work in the school. Is the SENCO talking to the DSL? Is the DSL talking to the head of year? Is the head of year talking to the form tutor? Everyone needs to be on the same page about the pupil. What interventions are being put in place, whether they're being tracked, whether they're effective. But if everyone isn't talking to each other, you're going to get disjointed work that's going to be ineffective. So that's before an exclusion. When it comes to the head teacher's decision making, governors can introduce they can suggest some approaches that will help with that. The first is to introduce a pre-exclusion checklist. I absolutely insist on this now. And it's a checklist that has detailed questions that Mital talked about, all the different aspects that you need to consider, whether send, lack, vulnerabilities, all of those things are included in the checklist. And it's such a helpful tool because it just stops the head teacher from jumping to conclusions about things, and it stops them missing things. So they actually will go through that checklist very carefully and think about each question. And then at the end, they submit that into the evidence. So they are saying, I've considered all of these factors in my decision. I'm still going to decide to do X. In the meeting, I think it's really important to ask the head teacher who they've consulted, because head teachers absolutely should be consulting before they make a decision. It will help in a 5-minute conversation with head teachers. I can suddenly identify alternatives they haven't thought of, or I will identify vulnerabilities that they didn't think about. And it's simply because, again, having that objective voice, somebody you can use as a sounding board who's free of the emotion, can help you make that decision. So they absolutely should be consulting, whether it's with their head of year who knows the pupil the best, or the SENCO who might know the pupil the best, the head of governance if it's a MAT, another head teacher. Just talk to someone and try to remove the emotion from the process and understand if your decision is proportionate. The standard that was discussed in Mital's slides, the problem with the standard of balanced probabilities is that, unfortunately, because it's so much lower than the criminal standard of beyond reasonable doubt, people tend to introduce really shoddy evidence because they think, well, it's just more likely than not, so it doesn't matter. But actually it does matter, because you're actually influencing the entire, this is going to impact this child's life. So I've seen photographs of knives that are literally this big, but because they don't have a ruler alongside, it looks enormous. These are evidentiary things that actually really matter. So hold your school to account. They can do it. Witness statements should be signed. They should be dated. You should know who wrote them. They shouldn't be scribed by teachers unless it's absolutely necessary. These kinds of things are to me, very important, because you are actually affecting this child's life. And then again, going back to the serious harm, make sure your head teacher addresses the serious harm aspect. What is it about having them come back that's going to seriously harm all the rest of the people in the school? And then with persistent breaches, it's a very different standard. You have to actually show interventions with persistent breaches. And then I think the really important thing to ask is, why now? What's the tipping point? And the reason that's important, obviously, is because the timing is super important. If you do it in late year 10 or early year 11, it indicates some other motivations there. Maybe they're trying to protect their results and kind of just get rid of the problem kids as they see them. So understanding why persistent breaches, why the permanent exclusion is happening at this point versus, a year ago, and what is it that's changed? So asking those questions. And then parents. Governors can absolutely influence having parents, allowing them a greater voice in the process. Asking the school about parental communications. Did they get the letters? Did they understand the letters? Are you sure they can read? Are you sure they can read in English? So I've included sort of EAL, what I call EAL headers, and it just says in something like 10 different languages, it says, this is an important letter. If you can't read in English, please contact the school. And it's in various different languages. And the idea is, if you know your family's from Pakistan, or you know their language is Urdu, you put that at the top of the letter. And if they can't read the letter, then they will contact the school. And it's so important. That tiny little thing can make a huge difference to allowing them to access the information. For me, I don't allow head teachers to permanently exclude unless they've met with a family. You absolutely have to meet with, and it happens all the time. The head teachers will exclude without even having met with the family, to hear the pupil's side of things, to hear the family side of things. And it's a real lost opportunity, because there's often mitigating evidence they don't hear about, and then it comes up with the hearing when it's too late, And so it's absolutely crucial that they have some part to play before the decision to exclude is made. Hearings are set at terrible times, Tuesdays at 10 a.m. I mean, how many parents can take off a day to come to a hearing? Try to accommodate the parent's schedule and make sure that they can make it. And when you're in the meeting, if it's appropriate, like Mital said, absolutely engage the pupil, talk to them directly, and spend the time to really try, because of course they're going to initially not want to talk, but they will eventually open up, and it will be very valuable. Interpreters, I've seen uncles and aunts and all kinds of people used as interpreters. It can be really problematic because they're often not equipped to do it, and often they end up doing all the talking instead of the parent. So if school can afford an interpreter, I think they absolutely should be using them. They can use a staff member, but they have to be careful that they're objective and they haven't got a relationship with the pupil. If the parents are not there, and we all know that lots of meetings happen where parents are not there, I ask my governors to ask the questions that the parents would have asked. Just make sure that that parental perspective is there and you actually ask those questions. And the final thing is, use your clerk. If you have a good clerk, they are an amazing liaison with the parents and the family. I ask my clerks to meet with them in advance, to describe the entire process, to explain it all to them, to put them at ease. And it's transformative. They actually suddenly feel like they're part of the process, and it's entirely through that clerk as the liaison. The final thing is, with your exclusion review hearing, how can you make sure that you're reaching a fair and reasonable decision? So insist on training, because exclusion is like a language. If you don't use it, you lose it. There's so many details about it. So ask for training on a regular basis. I have included a suggested questions list. It's very helpful just to look through that, to think, oh, I didn't think of that question. Let's ask that one. So again, it's just lists and checklists. That's my favorite thing. I have a deliberations checklist for you. And it's literally, again, looking through everything that Mital talked about, all the different standards and all the things that you're meant to do as a governor, so that you don't miss anything. And then what you do at the end is you sign and date it, and that becomes part of the evidence. That goes on to the independent review panel, and they can say, oh, so you actually answered all these questions for yourselves before you decide. And that's very powerful. again, as Mittal said, you have to be familiar with your SEND code of practice. You have to understand reasonable adjustments and how they're used in behavior policies. And remember your safeguarding responsibilities. I can't say it enough. If a kid is bringing drugs in or involved in drugs, maybe they're involved in county lines. You've got to be thinking about these things. You've got to protect the pupil as much as you're protecting your school. The natural principles of justice that Mittal talked about, the reason they're called natural is because we all know it. We feel it here. We know in our gut when an exclusion is just wrong. And so I'm asking governors, trust your gut. If you feel it's wrong, it's probably wrong. And I can't tell you how often people don't listen to their gut. Remember, these are my final 2 points. Sorry, I know I'm going over my 12 minutes. You're reviewing all of the evidence. You're not just saying to yourself, oh, was the head teacher's decision reasonable at the time it was made? No. If you get additional information in that hearing, you get to consider that. You're considering all of the evidence. And then finally, the biggest point of all, don't be afraid to overturn when it's necessary. You are not there to support the head teacher. You are there to support legal exclusion processes. I can't tell you how many times I've heard governors say, well, you know, if we've got to support the school. No, because actually you're not doing them a favor if you're upholding an exclusion that shouldn't be upheld. You're not doing anyone a favor. So that's me. Sorry about the slide issue. You'll get them.
Thank you, Samira. That was brilliant. Loads of practical tips there. And we have shared in the chat details of how you can get the slides. We'll come back to that after the webinar as well. So don't worry, everyone, they will be available. I just wanted to ask you one question, Samira, which I think you picked up on there at the end. But so when governors are reviewing an exclusion, do they have the remit to look at it in total again, or is it just limited to looking at the process?
So for me, the key thing was the change that was made in 2017. They added some language to the guidance, paragraph 71. They basically said they've added that the responsibility of governing bodies is the board is to consider the language that was added was any evidence that was presented to the governing board in relation to the decision to exclude. So that's an additional piece they added, which absolutely, to me, makes clear that governors are supposed to look at the entire decision. So they're not just looking at the reasonableness of the head teacher's decision at the time it was made, they're looking at the whole thing, which makes sense if you think about it, because in a hearing, you're going to get a lot of additional information that the head teacher probably didn't hear. So absolutely, they need to be looking at it fresh.
That's great. Thank you, Samira. We're going to move on now to Eliza Ribeiro. Eliza is the CEO of the charity Lives Not Knives, and Eliza founded that charity in 2007 when she was 14. But she's also a governor. Lives Not Knives is an amazing charity that works to prevent knife crime, youth violence and school exclusions by engaging, educating and empowering young people and supporting them to their future prospects. So Samira, it's over to you. I'm just going to check that the line's okay. I had a little bit of interference there, but I'll let you get started and we'll see how it goes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. I'm going to start with a bit about my journey and understanding how we got from being 14 to where Lives Not Knives is now. So in primary school, I was amazing. I loved going to school. I attended and was such a happy child. And then I was in the netball team. I was in the choir. I got my amazing SATs results and I was able to get into the secondary school that my mum wanted for me and that I wanted to go to. It was a Catholic all-girls school and was actually quite strict. Within the second week of me being there, I already had an issue where we had been writing notes back and forth in class and a teacher had found it, and unfortunately I was the only one that refused to snitch or speak on what the notes are about and what we had spoken about. This then led to me having to have a meeting with the head teacher, and this was my second week of school, so I was only 11 years old. The head teacher expressed that I should have never been in the school because my parents were divorced and that I had issues and refused to speak to adults because of the lack of a man and a father in my home. this was shocking, and I immediately said I didn't want to be there and asked for a managed move or asked what my next steps were. I think after hearing that at 11 as well, and also understanding you don't want to be there, it kind of puts a block on everything you did enjoy from school. Anyway, I carried on there. I was in top set. I was achieving all my academic goals, but I wasn't proud to be at that school. I was completely insulted by what my head had to say. And I didn't want to take part in any other extracurricular activities, such as choir, such as netball, and anything else that they wanted me to be a part of. I would say behavior-wise, yes, I shouted, yes, I screamed, yes, I had the odd argument, but it was nothing violent, no, nothing drug-related, no bringing anything else into school, nothing that I see a lot of when we're looking at exclusions now for the young people that I work with through Lives Not Knives. From year 7 into year 8, I openly told teachers I didn't like school and I didn't want to be there. I repeatedly asked for managed move. I wrote letters. I spoke to my head of year, anyone that would listen. And then they told me that for me to put that much effort into wanting a managed move, there was something wrong with me, and that I either had ADHD, ADD, or other form of special educational needs. I told them that I didn't believe that, but they refused to get me tested. They then said that I needed psychiatric help and found someone that I had to stay after school with and lie on a sofa while she spoke to me about the issues that I had from my parents' divorce, which has, as I would say, nothing to do with it. After that happened, I said that I never wanted to see that lady again. I was absolutely fine. I then was excluded over 20 times between one day to over 3 weeks. One of these exclusions, for example, coming into school in white socks and a white ribbon in my hair and being excluded on the spot and sent away from the school gates because the decision had been made to change the uniform whilst I was excluded and was unaware. They then drove me to a pupil referral unit on a day trip. My English teacher told me it would shock me and scare me into behaving better because it would be somewhere I wouldn't want to attend. I think it was only a few weeks after that that I was actually called for the governor's meeting to discuss the exclusion process and where it would go from there. The board meeting literally lasted a few minutes. Clearly a decision had already been made before I even attended or was asked to attend, as the paperwork had already been drawn up and was given to me after the meeting. All of my files already there with the letter in decision to exclude me. I was not then in education from year 8 until the end of year 10, June, for me to start in year 11. So I missed the whole of half of year 8, year 9 and year 10, when in school I was predicted 11A statuses. Following that, I pushed and pushed to actually be in education. I attended a pupil referral unit in Croydon for 2 weeks. And then they asked my mum to come into a meeting where they told her that I was not allowed to attend anymore because I was too pretty and I would distract all the boys. It then led to me only going in for my year 11s and for certain classes. It was only then I realised I wouldn't be able to study science, geography, history, but would instead have to study sports and other things such as citizenship and PSHE because they were easy wins and they wanted me to receive as many qualifications as possible. I also had to fight to study at college 1 day a week, as they saw that if I studied at college 1 day a week, there would be no financial gain for them with me going there. And unfortunately, it would affect my other studies, such as sport, which I didn't want to study in the first place. I was removed from sitting all exams and put in a room alone. They said that they needed the results from me, and there was a high chance that all of the other young people in the pupil referral unit with me would be disqualified, which was in the end true. At the pupil referral unit, I saw someone get stabbed in the head. I watched half of my classmates get pepper sprayed whilst my teacher locked me in the school to protect me. I was sent home for having a water fight with other pupils. And when I refused to leave the property and apologised and said I wanted to go to my English lesson, they called the police on me, who in turn arrested me on site. And I was put in a cell for 12 hours. I saw my maths teacher be physically beaten up by pupils in front of the class. It was the first time I'd ever tried drugs or alcohol. And I was one of 5 girls with 40 boys, and not feeling comfortable enough to wear skinny jeans, wear a skirt, and having to go into school every day in baggy clothes because you would be sexualized. Then being told I wasn't allowed to school in baggy clothes and would have to change because it wasn't part of the uniform. I understood that I wouldn't be able to then move forward through some of these traumatic experiences. I had no mental support, nobody to talk to. I think growing up as an adult, I didn't trust anyone. I found it really hard to meet new people, to socialize in different circles. I thought that everyone was angry or violent. And then when trying to go to college and move forward with my life, understanding that a lot of the people who were then 16 are trying drinks for the first time or trying drugs for the first time, etc. And me genuinely feeling like I'd moved past that stage in my life and I didn't fit in with them. It's weird because all of these experiences then led me to start LNK so that other young people wouldn't have to go through that. Now what Life's Not Knives does is we aim to engage, educate and empower young people who are at the highest risk of exclusion, mentoring them in-house and understanding their behaviours so that we can offer support, we can offer someone for them to speak to and engage with in school, as we know that a lot of them don't like school and don't want to be there, and understanding the issues as to why they don't want to be there. Often we find a lot of the young people that are referred to us have been through traumatic experiences of their own. We've had disclosures of sexual abuse and sexual assault in the home, domestic abuse and domestic violence in the home, and understanding that these young people felt alone, felt excluded and felt misunderstood, and in turn their behaviour came out in the classroom. It's also with these traumatic experiences that they weren't able to disclose to someone that they thought they could trust in school because they were often told off or told that they were acting out or told that their emotions were misplaced, that they didn't feel safe in school to actually speak about or understand these experiences, or that they should have never gone through them. So trying to normalize and understand that actually they thought a lot of that they had been through was normal. I would say moving forward to engage with more mentoring opportunities and so that they can understand better why a child might not enjoy school or might not want to be there, and make that experience better for that young person. We need to improve alternative education, look at the support young people get once they've been excluded from school, and if that is actually beneficial for them, or if it would be better to kind of homeschool them, or for us to find a different provision for them. I would say that my mum, who was trying to run her own business at the time, was called excessively and had to be at the school every 1 or 3 days. And I understand it was my own behaviour, but also I don't think there was any support for a parent. There was nobody who to speak to her about the process, to understand the process, or understand what the next steps were after I was excluded, especially for the silliness of being excluded for wearing the wrong socks and the wrong ribbon, and then having to call my mum out and her to drive half an hour down the road and get me, etc. I would say as well, if exclusions are already planned, they should have shared that plan with the parent and the child. It should not be an experience that the young person and their parent should go through alone, and the child should still feel in control and understand what their next steps are, because it is their life. They shouldn't feel excluded from their education, and they should have a right to their education and understand that after exclusion, the same opportunities aren't there, such as the choices that they can further make and the level of education that they might receive. So thank you.
Eliza, thank you so much for sharing your story with us. There are comments coming in about how much it's impacted on people. I know, same for me, and I can see the same for other panelists as well. It's a really moving story. I wanted to ask you if you can, that last governors meeting that you had where you were excluded and you said that you felt the decision had been made already, can you just sum up how that felt and what you felt like in that meeting?
I feel like there was a lack of understanding or asking for my opinion or what I felt like had gone wrong or why I didn't want to be there in the first place. I think after a year and a half of asking for a managed move and knowing you don't want to be somewhere, it wasn't necessarily a shock that I would be excluded after that many suspensions. But I think it was a shock to have to formally invite me into the school and have a meeting about it and do all of the process when you guys had already made up your decision. It was kind of like giving me a false hope of actually I might be able to still get managed move, or we might be able to deal with it this way, or and a false sense that I was being listened to or heard. I think it was actually saying, you are a child, we've made the decision, you're done now, instead of actually listening and understanding why I didn't want to be there. And I think if some of the governors had heard my experience and why I didn't want to be there, they might have seen the head teacher a bit differently and understood that some of the practices she had for other pupils weren't necessarily the right ones for me. And some of the things she said to me weren't correct, making it easier for other young people moving forward in that school.
Did you feel like you had an adult present during those proceedings who was on your side? I mean,
I have never been one to lie to my mum, and I'm very, very grateful that I have a mum who understands and listens to me, and I can be 100% honest here. And I'll put my hands up, from when I was in the wrong, I was in the wrong. But often, I mean, I got in trouble and sent to isolation for asking in religious studies, if Jesus was a Jew, why aren't we Jewish? And this was when I was 11 years old, and it's silly things like that that you're questioning and that you're asking questions. But I think getting in trouble for it and getting excluded for it and being punished for it isn't a way to educate a young person.
Thank you, Eliza. I should just say there's lots of comments coming in the chat using the word amazing. What an amazing young woman. So I just wanted to share that with you.
Thank you.
One question I wanted to put to all of our panelists was, if you were facing a governing board who feel reluctant to challenge a head's decision for whatever reason, perhaps the relationship isn't there, could you give a couple of prompts as to how they could start to do that?
Who do you want to start? Yeah. I think the key is to explain to governors that again, it goes back to the supporting question. You know, they're not supporting a head teacher if they support a decision that's just downright wrong and unfair and illegal. They have to rise above the entire thing and actually look at it from the perspective of natural principles of justice, and actually recognize that they are potentially actually protecting the school from further issues down the road. I mean, let's not forget, there are IRPs. I know they're difficult to win. I get that. They're stacked against the parents again. But I think the key is to turn to the head teacher and say, look, I'm doing this for you because this is a decision that won't stand up. And I think if you put it in those terms, then you can carry on in your relationship and it will be fine, because they will see that you're doing it for the right reasons. They need to see you as a principled person, as a governor. You have to be principled. You're not just there to support the head teacher. You're there to support principals and the pupils. So yeah, yeah, I don't know if that would help governors, but that's my advice.
Great, thank you, Samira. Mital, I've got one that might be for you, which is where governors receive an evidence package in advance of a review panel, what rights do they have? Do they have rights to ask for additional information to make further inquiries themselves?
If they receive a pack, the governors receive the pack.
Yeah.
I mean, it depends on the circumstances and which part of the process that we're in, but I would say that it's up for the parents and the school to create to provide the evidence, not create obviously, but to provide the evidence. If there's something that's glaringly missing, I don't see why that they couldn't ask for that. And obviously they have an opportunity in the meeting to scrutinise information that isn't there. And quite often that does happen, but it's what's done with that information that, you know, with those responses or lack of information.
I've had governors ask for additional information, and what they'll often do is say, can you please bring it to the meeting if it can't be produced in advance? And then they take a short adjournment to look at the information that they requested. So I've definitely seen that happen, and governors absolutely should feel comfortable doing that.
Yeah, the only time I feel it's problematic is when it's a reconsideration hearing, and if you're requesting documents at that stage, you have to really think about what the purpose of that document is, because obviously the time passed, it will be quite a long time, and what the purpose of that is, and if it actually effectively helps the situation, because if you have evidence that you can make a decision on, like Samira said, the point is to be considering the entire decision at that point. And I agree with her analysis of what the guidance amendments are, but yeah, I think it depends, especially in the reconsidering, it depends. But at the first initial governing body hearing, I agree. Definitely go ahead and ask, and that's your job to scrutinise. So.
Well, thank you to Samira, Mital and Eliza. We're coming to the end of our session, so I'm going to say thank you for joining us today and for sharing your tips, experience and stories. For all of the people joining us on the webinar, thank you for joining us. This session has been recorded. It will be available to watch on the Governors for School website shortly, and we'll email you when it's ready. We'll also be making available some of the resources and tools we've heard mentioned in these two webinars, so that we can help build a culture of challenge around decisions to exclude. So we'll be in touch about that as well. And thank you all for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.